My name's Maureen Metcalf. I'm your host. With us today, I am delighted to have Belinda Gore. Belinda's a psychologist, coach, and experienced teacher. She uses the Enneagram system to help coaches and leadership consultants. So welcome, Belinda. I'm delighted that you're here.
Thanks. This is great. I'm glad to be here, too. We've had lots of conversations over many, many years about this material, but this is a great way to touch base on where we are now.
What's personality type? We've all heard the words, and my guess is most people think they know what it is, and we may be defining it differently.
Well, bear in mind here, and bear with me, I am a psychologist by training and practice, and so I'm interested in things like ego development. I think, to put it simply, personality type is a way of looking at all the data of how people behave and how people think and what people's biases and beliefs are, and looking for patterns. And there are patterns. Now, the early way we've looked at leadership patterns is type A and type B, but that's pretty simplistic. So if we take that a little further, lots of people are familiar with Strengths Finders, which was a Gallup effort to collect data and find patterns. But in looking at personality type, some typologies are more based on a theory of why we are the way we are, not just to define types in terms of patterns of different ways different people operate.
Some people argue about the validity of personality type assessments. And I know you did some work with Hilke Rickmer and her doctoral work in discussing the efficacy of the Enneagram system and how it's used specifically in leadership development.
Right. More specifically, her doctoral research looked at a leadership development program for middle managers. We were not so much validating the typology of are the discrete types accurately identified and reflected in the system. There is other research to support that, but rather how effective was that system in supporting middle managers in first being able to cultivate greater self-awareness and then to be able to better understand the similarities and differences in the people they managed, and also in terms of leading upstream, of understanding the nature of senior leadership decision-making and how to translate that in implementation of strategic decisions.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. One of my personal goals is to use well-researched frameworks, and I know people get into the discussion about which ones are most valid and all of that. And what was most interesting to me about this is this typology is useful in developing leaders.
Right. Let me speak just for a moment about this whole validity issue. We're a very individualistic society, and some people are resistant to the idea of typology. They say, you can't pigeonhole me. But that's as misguided as believing that we don't have similarities of patterns in our physiological makeup as well as our psychological makeup. I mean, everybody has a different body, but we all have a skeleton that's pretty much the same, and we all have organs and musculature, and fortunately we can learn about that and provide for good health care. Similarly, if I'm looking at personality in the same way that I look at my physiological patterns, then if I know that I'm prone to diabetes because of family patterns, I behave in certain ways to prevent becoming diabetic. And if I know that I have a type 3 Enneagram structuring, then I know there are things for me to look for that will allow me to be more effective as a leader.
I have used this. I know what the strengths are. I know what the challenges are.
Right.
And that awareness has helped me interact with people more effectively.
Exactly. I think it's interesting. This was almost 20 years ago, but the Stanford Graduate School of Business asked its advisory council, so, big leaders around the world, what they should focus on in their curriculum in training business leaders. And they were very surprised, frankly, that the huge majority said the most important thing was to cultivate self-awareness and reduce denial. I mean, of all the budgeting and technology and management, blah, 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 that the most important thing is self-awareness, because that's what guides our decision making.
So I just finished teaching an MBA class. And when we went around at the end of the class and talked about what they had learned in this semester, what typically seemed to come out was, I thought I was going to learn about leadership, but really I learned about myself.
Right.
And making the connection that if I don't know who I am, having the checklist of how leaders behave is really inauthentic because I'm mimicking what somebody else does, not having the practice of presence.
And at the same time, not understanding that I'm having an impact on the organization, whether I know it or not. It's a very interesting research at the Glenn School at Ohio State University about how the financial decision-making of CEOs and CFOs, how that was directly impacting the financial decision-making in the company. I think you and I attended that program together some years ago. And I was really struck by how the research was very tight. In fact, leaders affect their organizations. Organizations come to be shaped by the personalities of the leaders.
And that goes all the way from CEO down to the
middle managers, team leaders. That's exactly right.
So if I'm risk averse, which was the example of the CEO study, those who have multiple houses tend to be more willing to spend in their business, and those who are very conservative financially run a very different type of organization financially.
Exactly.
Which is fascinating to me.
Yes.
And coming from a place of self-awareness, I can modulate how I choose.
Yes, I can be aware of those patterns so that instead of being reactive based on what my gut instinct is, sometimes gut instinct is great and sometimes it's just an unconscious pattern based on my personality type and what my early life experiences were, and it feels right to me, but it's not really good decision making for my organization.
Well, which is interesting to discern, right?
Right, exactly.
I want to give another example of where type guides me in working, not only with myself, but with others.
Yes.
I have a very close friend who's a challenger type. And what I learned as we were dealing with an incredibly complex situation was she always jumps in with the answer. And I found myself deferring because I thought someone with that confidence must be right.
Yeah. And that's just really her personality strategy.
She's no more right or no more thoughtful than I am, but I needed to be aware of that inclination because I was reading it as the only time I am that clear is when I've done a lot of research and I know the answer.
Yeah.
Other people react differently, and for me to be able to evaluate and categorize almost, what does this response mean from this person versus when you would jump in the same way?
One thing I always say when I'm teaching the Enneagram in terms of interpersonal relationship is the biggest trouble we all get in when we're dealing with other people is we assume other people are just like us. And so we believe that what they do and what they say is the same as what we would do or say, given a certain orientation, a certain take on a situation. And that's not true. So we either think people are just like us or we think they should be, and we try to get them to change to be that way. Yeah.
It would be nice if everyone was.
Just like me, yes.
It would make life easier.
We could change the world, yes.
And we just received a question from our engineer to ask about what is this thing. So we want to go into a little more detail of what is the Enneagram and just quickly, what are the 9 types? And one of the things, Belinda, that you've talked about is the idea that we're not one type, but in fact, having access to all types is a sign of maturity.
Right. So first of all, Enneagram is based on the Greek Ennea for 9 and a diagram of 9 equidistant points around a circle. So there are 9 patterns that have been identified in 3 subgroupings. And I won't go into all of the various ways we can use the Enneagram, but it's really a pretty sophisticated tool. I often say that the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, tilled the soil to get us ready for some more sophisticated ways of understanding how ego development works and manifests as different personality styles. A real quick run through. This is hardly fair to the system, but let's give it a try. Type 1 is sometimes known as the reformer, and Type 1 leaders are very clear about setting expectations, guidelines, the right way to do things, and can be rigid, but can also take that capacity for seeing the right way and recognize the kinds of improvements that need to be made. So they're leaders you can rely on to hold steady on a course. We think about people like, I'll use Ralph Nader, for instance, who was always looking to how do we improve? So it's that focus on improvement and reforming. Type 2 is sometimes called the helper. It's a more emotional type or style. And in leadership, these are leaders who are very concerned about the welfare and well-being, both of employees and of other people. And so sometimes leaders in nonprofits who are looking at how do we make the world a better place? How do we help people?
So if you're a Star Trek fan, this is Dr. McCoy.
Okay.
And if you're a Star Trek fan, Type 1 is Spock.
Spock, yes, indeed. Who seems somewhat unemotional, but we know underneath that he really does have some very clear emotional patterns. Type 3 is sometimes called the motivator. There are a lot of high-level leaders who function at Type 3 because there's an orientation to what will be successful. What will make the organization successful? What do we need to do to achieve our goals, to function in a way that will be both profitable and be admired in the industry? Mm-hmm. So higher level Type 3s are actually good leaders for organizations because our culture is somewhat 3-ish. Type 4 is, again, more emotional. 4s are great innovators because they are highly individualistic and are interested in the individualism of people on the team. And how can we be creative? How can we do things in new ways? Obviously, that's better in research and development, maybe, or in arts organizations. Sometimes people find that there's too much emotionality in the leadership development work that I've done at The Ohio State University. In the results that I get, Type 4 is usually pretty low in the personality profiles of emerging leaders.
I work with engineers and there aren't many.
There aren't any. But we go to Type 5 and now you start getting more into engineers. 5 is more of a thinking type. There is an orientation to doing research, gathering data, seeing the patterns, predict and control. But data is what is more highly valued. And often emotional skills are underdeveloped. And so we make jokes about engineers, but in fact, we know that in organizations that are highly oriented in that way, it's like, forget about office parties for birthdays. And also, let's not worry about dress codes. You know, we have work to do here.
Yeah. So that's Bill Gates. And I have a story about a colleague. I tend to surround myself with Type 5s.
Yes.
I'm not. And so the thing that has been fascinating to me about understanding my colleagues who are of this type is they're so often having a conversation in their heads that's probably more interesting than anything I could say. So an exciting lunch with someone who's a Type 5 is watching them do a crossword puzzle.
Well,
I'm thinking of a very specific person in my life.
All right.
So for me, it was important to learn that quiet was not a personal affront. It's just...
Right. Yes. A word that's used with Type 5 is eccentric and sometimes geeky. If you see photographs of Bill Gates when they were first starting the organization, I mean, he looks 12 years old with big, thick glasses on. You know,
he still looks...
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, that's reflective of that. Type 6 is sometimes called the traditionalist. The pattern of this type is toward fitting in, wanting to have agreements about roles and responsibilities, to have the structure in place, and functioning within that structure, even if there's a rebellion against it. One leader said, I want to know where the yellow line is in the middle of the road. I might choose to cross it, but it at least defines the limits, the structure of the road. Type 7 is much more entrepreneurial. It is a type that, given the choice of chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry, will always say all three, yes, and more. Yes. Optimistic, energetic, innovative, not always able to stay with something to take a deeper dive. And so they might get bored and go off onto another track that would not be as useful for the organization's strategic goals. And then type 8 is the challenger that you were mentioning before. This is the boss, the kind of my way or the highway. And again, we have a lot of strong leaders in big positions around the world who function in that way. And I might say that both Trump and Putin are type 8 personalities.
The image I have in my presentation is John Wayne.
Sure. Yeah. But
you can count on me.
There is a solidity to that type. John Wayne is the version that's quieter. Okay. And there's a version that's not so quiet. Tony Soprano, for instance, is another version of that. So Tony Soprano and John Wayne.
What I think is interesting here is physiologically that we respond to the leader who has the answers. So as physiological beings, we're almost programmed in some ways to trust someone like this, although I would not personally want Tony Soprano leading much of anything.
I think when we talk about presence later, often people with type 8 personalities are large in their presence, whether that's a big body, a heavy body. But when they come in the room, you kind of feel the
big personality.
The big personality. Exactly.
Interestingly, big personality doesn't necessarily mean better leader.
Exactly. But it's like the inner kid in all of us says, oh, here's a grown-up. You know, he or she obviously knows what she's doing. That's not always true. There are people of this personality type who are not healthy at all, but they have the confidence and the presence to seem to say, follow me, we'll be fine.
Yeah, follow me, we'll be fine, irrespective of the reality.
Yeah, because follow me means we're going to do it my way. You know.
Yeah.
Was it Patton who said, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead? Whoever that was. It's like, we're doing this and damn the torpedoes. And that's not always a good position to take when you're leading.
Especially in a complex environment.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, and then type 9.
Yes. The 9 pattern is sometimes called the peacemaker or the mediator. And the real strength here is the ability to see situations through multiple perspectives. When a person with a type 9 personality is well-grounded and pretty healthy, they can hold their own perspective and then identify with other people's perspectives as well. There's a capacity to feel into what's going on in the dynamics of the situation and maybe the leadership group or with the vendors or with the competitors, and sense a direction that will be the least conflictual, really.
One of the examples I use here is Lincoln.
Yes.
So not that they avoid conflict when conflict is required, but they don't create additional conflict.
And try to mediate. There's some debate about, is Obama a 9 or a 3? And as a 3, I tended to see some 9-ishness. I haven't talked with him, so I don't know. But his desire to find a way that would use diplomacy rather than force is more of a 9 style.
we're not going politics, but to use examples of Trump being an 8, more force, Obama being, if not 9, strong access to 9, more diplomatic. As we think about who do we want leading our country or our company or our group, understanding these kinds of orientations is helpful.
Yes, and different circumstances really call for different styles of leadership. But something you mentioned earlier is that the most important thing is that a leader is being authentic to her personality style. So that if I know who I am, I'm not going to try to pretend to be something else, but rather I'm going to recognize where my root core type is, and then know that I have access to all 8 other patterns, but I do that consciously rather than trying to mimic someone else.
So let's talk briefly about that idea that I have access to all. We often put someone in a box and say you're a 3 or you're an extrovert or an introvert, as if that's a label that can't be removed. And you're saying, I know my core type, and yet it's like the dial on the radio. I can change the dial if I don't want to listen to the news.
Right. The personality pattern is our default position. It's where we will go if we don't use consciousness to assess the situation and identify what is most called for. It's also, though, that if I know that I'm not a particularly good mediator, that would be useful for me to bring in someone else, to have a person with mediator skills on the leadership team and bring that person in and give them the support and the authority to do the things that I'm not so highly skilled at.
We were joking about it would be nice if everyone were us. And yet the reality is effective organizations have all types.
Yes.
And hopefully in the proportion that allows us to do our work most effectively.
Yes.
So we would select based on personality type as well as skill, and often we call that fit.
And what organizations have to be careful about is that they don't say, okay, here's our culture. This is who we want to be, so we want to bring in everybody who's just like us. And so the diversity isn't available within the organization. Lots of times I talk with HR people about diversity isn't just ethnicity, et cetera, but also in terms of orientation, perspective, personality patterns, and that a strong organization needs diversity in skills, in psychological skills to deal with a variety of circumstances in a highly changing world.
So I think of the contrast between Obama and Trump. At any given time, you need both of those types on the team, but ultimately having strong capacity in both, rather than the pendulum swinging back and forth between administrations, having administrations that are highly populated with the capacity to be forceful and the capacity to be diplomatic.
And as we spoke about Lincoln, I think one of the things that surprised so many people was that he brought onto his cabinet people who were supposedly his enemies. He understood the value of having all voices represented.
And in fact, when we look at some of the Leader 2050 competencies, one of them is collaboration and the ability not just to get along with people who are like me, but the importance of soliciting alternate perspectives and integrating, not bending to, but you want force, you want diplomacy. What is the complex solution that leverages both qualities, and the proportion changes based on the specific situation.
Knowledge of the Enneagram helps us understand the motivation behind certain behaviors so that we don't get caught in reactive behavior but can be responsive. And I think that's one thing you're talking about is how do we become responsive to the circumstances around us and make choices based on what tends to motivate me, and is that an appropriate response to what I'm dealing with in the moment? And how can I draw on other people's strengths to engage what they can be passionate about? Because that provides the extra energy that will keep a team going during difficult times, because somebody is passionate about one thing that can drive us forward that can affect the psychological emotional field in the group, as well as just the tasks that need to be done.
So as the leader of a group, highly important is that ability to sense and experience where people have energy, where they have an orientation or a bias, and basically like being a good chef. I'm pulling the ingredients to make a fabulous meal being the work product.
Right.
Or the outcome for a client or for a nation.
Right.
To leverage the best of each person. And part of that is type and energy.
And then that also relates to how do I speak to somebody who has a different perspective and motivation than I do. In leadership training, one of the things that we do that maybe we can talk about a little more in detail is learning how to speak to people of different types in ways that are effective.
We were talking about how an understanding of type helps me relate better and talk to people differently.
Yeah. Communicate effectively, really. In the leadership development program that we researched with the doctoral research that I was speaking about earlier, we did a lot of role play, and we created situations that were pretty standard in the company. Write down how you would normally handle that. And then now you know that this person has a type 7 personality style. How would you modify what you would say? Then we have somebody who does have a type 7 personality be the person in the role play, and various members of the group would come up and deal with that individual in that role play situation based on what they thought was effective. And the type 7 person would indicate thumbs up or thumbs down. Was that an effective communication for them? And people were stunned by how many thumbs downs they got. And these are pretty seasoned middle managers. They say, this has always worked for me. Well, no, it's always been your preferred way of dealing with things.
That doesn't even
but it
work.
doesn't land with people of types who are pretty different from yours. So that was a great learning. Part of the feedback we received from participants was two things: a desire for more training to really stay with the system, to really understand it, and also to build out implementation of training for all employees so that, as you were saying earlier, there's a shared vocabulary, shared orientation about how does all of this work.
And that's where I go when people try to move into the disagreements about this system is better than that system, is in some ways, while I prefer the Enneagram, I want to be agnostic and say that the point isn't to open your brain and clearly predict every part of you, but it is to have a system that most closely approximates and that we can use effectively. So let's get about doing...
It works.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and if it gets better, and I'm sure the folks at the Enneagram Institute continue to build on what they've done and refine, just as we do in other areas of the world.
There is an International Enneagram Association that covers the whole Enneagram community globally. There are a number of people who teach about the Enneagram in business. There are a lot of resources now available.
When we were working together, initially we talked about type as I am a type. And then we talked about I have access to all types. So it's not, I have to narrow myself down and be a type 3. But in fact, as I mature, I have more access to all types. Can you speak to that a little bit?
The thing is that we are whole beings, but we don't develop our whole selves. They say that a 2-year-old is a genius, and by the time we get to be 20, we have done what's called neural pruning so that our nervous systems have less and less capacity to be truly innovative. Given that, we have to recultivate our natural ability to have diverse skills. The core type is the taproot, the root that goes deepest into the unconscious that structures the personality. And so, as I said earlier, it's the default position. It's what we tend to believe, what we tend to do. If we don't stop and recognize our reactive tendencies and consciously think about other possible perspectives or other possible ways of responding to a situation.
And that idea of being conscious seems like such a simple idea, but over 90% of our behavior is unconscious.
Right.
My joke in groups is it's why I put my pants on every morning. It doesn't matter how tired I am. I never walk out of the house without garments.
Yes. Right.
It's good that my unconscious brain is programmed to do that.
Yes.
Because if I were tired, it would be really embarrassing to get someplace without
Clothes
proper attire.
Yes. Those are the nightmares many of us have, right?
Yeah, they are. We count on our unconscious brain, and yet we haven't always cultivated, and this moves us into presence, I think, into the capacity to know when to be conscious about things that I would otherwise do unconsciously.
Right. Unconscious patterns or even instinct allows us to deal with so much data, sensory input, information. We can't possibly consciously think about everything. We just, it's too much. However, conscious awareness means recognizing the patterns that shape our unconscious behavior so that we can recognize them. In our culture, the biggest challenge is to be fully in our bodies and to be aware of what's happening in the moment in our bodies that is relating to what's real in our environments.
Can you give an example? Because I know when I first started working with you, I would totally resist and say, I'm not in my body and that lets me do more. And the fact that I drink coffee all the time and I'm tired and I still get stuff done makes me more effective. Now we're learning from mindfulness and other areas that that is in fact false.
Right.
Can you say more or give an example of what it means to be in my body and how that actually helps me be a more effective leader?
I'm kind of taking this from a slightly different angle. Is that we develop ideas or concepts about what's going on, about who we are, our self-image, who other people are, what we believe is happening in the organization. And if you remember, I said that the Stanford Advisory Council said reducing denial. Well, denial is a defense mechanism against being aware of what's really happening. An example of that is that we find that leaders often solve problems they know how to solve rather than solving the problems that really exist.
I'm probably guilty of that.
So that if there are, staff problems, that if I believe that staff training in communication skills is the answer, then I set people up to go to communication training, which means that I may not be solving the problem of the interpersonal conflict that's right in front of me because I don't know how to do that. So I do something that I know how to do.
I play to my strengths or my biases. And so this idea of being in my body and how do I know when I am not on track?
Yes. Well, yeah, let's speak to first just what showing up means, which is what presence is.
Okay.
People sometimes talk about charisma as having a big presence, like we were talking about type 8 or challengers. I walk in the room, there's a big presence. But gravitas is a word sometimes we use to speak about how people walk in a room and maybe you don't notice them immediately, but if you're interacting with them, they seem really centered and grounded and present. I'm right here, right now. I'm making eye contact with you. You feel me present with you. You feel seen and heard, and you experience me as reliably right here and authentic. And that's what we're talking about with presence, that I'm showing up as the person I am to the best degree I am capable of doing that. And I'm able to stay present in myself to authentically relate to you as another person. You're not a character in my story.
That comment, that you're not a character in my story, merits exploration because for most of us, we've got the dialogue going in our head and it's, again, based on unconscious stories and experiences. And so how do I step out of that as the person who is present with you?
First, we look at what are the stories that I tend to tell myself. And that requires, as you said, some intrapersonal awareness and exploration, that I have to look at, what are my beliefs? What do I believe about, is everybody out to get me? Is everybody else smarter than I am? You know, there are lots of stories we tell ourselves, and we need to explore what's my belief about who I am and how I relate to the world and what the world is all about. And then I start to look for cues that I'm playing that story. One thing I do with people is to just say, if you're in the story that everybody's smarter than I am, let's take a few breaths and find out, what does that story feel like in your body? And sometimes people will feel like their shoulders are hunched, or they may have butterflies in their stomach, or they feel like they're little and they're looking up at the grown-ups.
Treading water. I have to work harder. So
yes.
I'm paddling. I'm the duck paddling so hard underwater to look smooth on the top.
Perfect. So that's a great example. Now, when you find yourself in situations, you can pause and say, how hard am I paddling? How fast are my little fins or feet going under the water?
And for me, what I often hear is, okay, you've suggested something that's an extra thing on my to-do list. Does that mean I'm going to be working till 10 tonight or 11? So I have to work harder to be as good as you are or as good as whomever. My mental calculation is always, what's the to-do list and how do I get it all done?
Yes, so that's what drives the paddling. Then the next thing we look at is, what do I have to do to be as good as you are? And that's a belief in a value being less than, and sometimes people feel better than, and sometimes people feel disconnected. So there are lots of ways that we discover we orient toward other people.
Hopefully this gave our listeners an idea of gravitas, that by understanding who I am, being more self-aware, understanding my story and how that innately drives everything I do, I can unplug from that story and actually be present with the precious humans around me, whether they're my colleagues or my boss or my children or the kids at the softball team or someone in my community. That ability to be present is the biggest gift we can give people.
And that's what authentic leadership is all about. And curiously, the more authentic we are, the more innovative we are.
As long as I can step out of the story,
yes,
I'm not maintaining that falsity.
And I can see other options because I'm not driven by staying in this rut.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.